I have a couple of questions that I'm going to ask the presenters, and then we'll open it up really for further questions based on how much and how the audience wants to participate. So I'm going to start actually with Greta. And Greta, thank you for your presentation today. And I think one of the things you started to talk about was what is really the most important data to analyze in employee analytics projects. And a lot of people were asking towards that, but maybe if you could begin to tell us a little bit more insight into what data is most important, that would be great.
Yeah, so I guess one thing that it comes back to, a lot of people talk about it as HR analytics, and we're trying to say it's employee analytics. And that data, people spend a short amount of time in HR, and then they jump out and go into their role unless they actually work in HR. Then that's different. And so all of the performance in terms of what they're doing in the role is typically captured outside of HR. And so for the kind of predictive work that we do, we think that it's really helpful to remember that actually the most important data, especially if you're trying to predict it, sits in the business system of the business unit. It doesn't typically sit in HR unless it's start and end date if you're predicting attrition. So I think all of us have said, as you can, try to also, it's not an either or, but, get that most important data is outside of HR as well.
Thank you. Tracey, can you share with us a couple of the challenges, the hardest, I think, analytic projects that you've seen firsthand as it relates to HR analytics and employee analytics?
Certainly. So I have a lot of contacts doing HR analytics across the globe, but I can tell you that regardless of the country, the frustrations and the challenges are actually very similar. So number one, for the leaders that are heading up the HR analytics function, number one, finding a high enough level of talent or sufficient number of data scientists, analysts, whatever you wish to call them. That's a fairly big challenge. Their second biggest frustration is actually, again, trying to put those dollar values on there, trying to prove or convince the leadership, not only within HR, but outside of HR, of the value of the HR analytics function. I've actually seen one company, and I won't say who they are in Canada, they're on the western side, actually eliminated their HR analytics function because they didn't prove the value. So if you are heading into that space, the advice I tend to give people is always find that piece where you can get a quick win up front, because if you're responsible for building that function, your leadership only has a certain amount of patience in reality. So if you don't show some piece of value within, say, the first 6 months that you're going to build this function, they tend to start to drift away and lose interest and say, maybe we should put our focus somewhere else. That aside, I think the other challenges tend to start get a little more specific on the data. So data you don't have, data integrity, data missing altogether. So trying to plan how you're going to resolve those issues. Some companies have those issues so substantial that they take a step back and say, you know what, we're not even ready for HR analytics until we start to clean up and fix its fundamental core pieces of data that we store.
Excellent, thank you. And Chami, a couple of questions for you, and they're all integrated. Maybe if you could share for the group where you see the global trends are right now in talent analytics. And as part of that, help us understand where in organizations are our analytic leaders coming from and who's developing them.
Sure. Certainly from personal experience, I find organizations that actually have data as an integral part of their strategy, those are the kinds of organizations that take HR analytics seriously, so to say. I mean, we are doing some work in Hong Kong and China at the moment with a global bank where we're helping them build a center of excellence. And in that case, the sponsor, they have a major sponsor that believes in analytics being a core function for the organization. So there's a value on HR analytics, there's a value on customer campaign, fraud risk. As far as leaders, do you train an analyst to be a business person, or do you train a business person to be an analyst? the age-old question. It's a tough one. I think it's the one. It's a person that actually communicates and can structure a business problem around data, communicate that with the business, because I find that's a big part of the problem is not being able to communicate with the business. And if the business doesn't understand, there you go. You've lost a sponsor there. So as far as trends go globally, Silicon Valley, unfortunately, seems to be one of the most predominant places where we see HR analytics as a key function. Aside from Google, where analytics actually reports to HR, I haven't come across many organizations that where analytics reports to HR. It seems to be a very separate function that's run separately, and then analytics run separately.
Great, and I'd just like to add one thing. Actually, I'm on the corporate advisory board for the George Washington University, and in particular help them with their Masters of Science program in Business Analytics. And it is interesting, we just had a meeting where we were talking about curriculum. So if you want to go further back into your future employees, right, it's students. And so we just had this discussion around curriculum, and one of the biggest challenges is the communication skills that you have to be helping your students really excel at and develop at the same time that they're becoming trained in analytics, or else they're not going to be able to communicate their findings, and they won't really have the same type of opportunities in the future. So it's interesting that you said that even at the more leadership level. I would say to you that that theme even is going through right now at the university level.
If you look at Silicon Valley, your typical or some of the most ideal data scientists, if you like, they come from a neuroscience background, so they're neuroscientists that have a good understanding of data, or folks with economics degrees that have a good solid understanding of econometrics, rather than the hardcore statistician that might not be as business focused as the other two.
Excellent. And then just one last question, and then we'll open it up. Do you believe there should be a consistent approach and structure to business analytic organizations? And if you believe it should be so, where do you think it should sit in an organization? And how can you ensure that the head of such an organization has a seat at the table of the C-suite?
So I've recently written a white paper on chief analytics officers. I personally have certainly have an opinion on where analytics should report. I think it should be a C-suite role, sitting at not a dotted line to the CEO, rather a C, reporting to the CEO, because that then becomes a very centric function. If you look at Innova Financial in the US, which is about 230 people, at least 80 of the organization sits in the analytics team, run by the chief analytics officer that reports to the CEO. A lot of data-driven companies have that model, so that's my personal opinion. I think it should be a C-suite role and a very centric function.
Just to ask the other panelists their opinion, and then we can open it up for comments, questions, anything you'd like.
Yeah, I love the seat at the table. I keep telling people the table cares about performance, and so the table, if the chief analytics officer is going to be showing things that affect the performance of the business, they have a seat at the table, because that's what the table cares about. So if they're not, and it just continues to be research and it's not showing results, then the organization gets bored very quickly too.
True.
And then they're like, so I think they should have a seat at the table, as should HR, as should call center people, as should everybody, but the table cares about performance. So, but I agree, I completely agree.
What we're seeing in HR analytics, so about 80% of companies have put that analytics function inside HR, but the remaining 20% have it in some sort of centralized strategy group. So that would be, that group that would eventually end up connecting to the C-suite. I think what we're going to see over time, so the maturity level of HR analytics is kind of here. Analytics in other spaces like marketing analytics, operational analytics, it's been going on for a very long time. So, I was doing analytics on the engineering side back in 1990, and now this is kind of a hot new topic in HR. Well, really, they're just trying to catch up. I think as they start to get closer to the level of the other ones, more businesses are going to see that it makes far more sense to put these two things together, because when you start to try and do the connections between HR and the rest of the business, where does the data reside, and how are you going to get that overall picture if you don't have all of those people together?
Thank you. Any questions, thoughts, comments? Yes.
When we look at workflow planning and predictive analytics, we always look at the history, from the beginning to the end. I wonder if we can do some reverse engineering. If we start from the end of the story, people that left the organization, we go for exit interviews, we plan everything backwards, everything, what was the engagement, what was the demographics, the psychographics, and everything else. We model something specifically for the future of the company, and we understand that return of investment, obviously, is going to be much more positive. Have you ever done something like that?
I'll ask Greta.
What we do is we model for now, but then the model learns as the future happens, because I almost said it's hard to predict the future. Isn't that funny? But you want your model not to be a one-time model. You want it to learn and get smarter as it happens. So it can do that quarterly. So, to put it too far in advance, say, hey, we think this is our 5-year plan or something. You can do that, but not at, let's say, a micro-segmentation level or at a, to really bring it down there. I think you can do it at a workforce planning level, maybe put it out there. But that's not the kind of work we do. We model, use history to model and predict now, but then it learns and goes into the future. I don't know.
Yeah, the workforce planning right now is, the core philosophy right now is to align it to that business planning process. So since in most companies that's a 1 to 5 year plan, they're trying to align their workforce planning to that. So we have gotten to the level where, I'm told I do one of the most mathematical versions of workforce planning, because some people send these templates to various pieces of the company, and it's almost like an opinion of how much headcount you think. I think I need 2 engineers, or I think I need a marketing professional. I try to connect it more to, what are the things that drive workload? Well, how do we segment down into the pieces of terminations, voluntary, involuntary, retirement, demographics of the baby boomers? I try to put that into the model. It really comes down to, what sort of data is available, what have they tracked over time, and then also what things do we want to consider for the future. So do we assume our business is becoming more efficient over time, and try to put those factors in. I haven't seen anybody then take, those component pieces of terminations and do that connection to engagement. Specifically for the reason that, that slide ahead up there with the correlation between engagement and turnover, because so many companies are finding a very weak relationship, it doesn't then end up being a valuable piece to add into that model. And then also workforce planning so then we are basing it on history, but there has to be a very good judgment of how much of that history is actually, do we think is representative of the future? Because when I was doing some of this stuff at FedEx, they were saying, well, no, let's go take a 10-year history. And I say that makes absolutely no sense, because I have seen the data on the terminations, and the world was a very different place prior to the back half of 2008 than it is after 2008. So you could see it in the data that the assumptions you would make based on this information were very different than this. That world prior to 2008 is never going to be the norm. We have this new norm since 2008. So you have, it's a little bit of science, but also you need that judgment of what does represent our future.
I'd just like to add, if I could, I like your approach, right? It's almost very much an economics approach to understanding kind of the cause. And I think that is, in fact, an established way of understanding very early indicators, but then maybe not necessarily be wedded to that, but then adjust it for what's happening today, and then put a future component to it. So on the one hand, you have the historical view. On the other hand, you're taking all of that as input and you're putting it into a learning machine so that you can actually use the past in a very disciplined way to move towards that type of understanding. Plus, you could have a win-back retention program, right? So out of that, you might be able to call some people up.